Welcome to Horrified Stories, where fear comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. The town of Ashwood Saturday quietly between two mountain ranges, shrouded in mist and shadow. Once a thriving logging town, its prosperity had faded decades ago, leaving behind a skeleton of its former self, empty storefronts, rusting equipment, and whispers of secrets best left buried. The locals were polite but distant, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. Something lingered beneath the surface of Ashwood, something unspoken, and nobody dared to acknowledge it. Laura Bennett had planned to return to Ashwood, the town where she grew up. Her childhood was filled with fragments of fear and mystery, with memories she'd worked hard to leave behind. But when her estranged mother died suddenly, Laura found herself back on the winding roads that led to the place she'd avoided for years. The funeral was small, attended by only a handful of the town's older residents. Laura barely recognized them. They looked worn and hollow, as though the years had drained them of life. As Laura sorted through her mother's estate, she found something odd. Hidden in a drawer, beneath stacks of old bills and receipts, was a diary. Its leather cover was cracked and weathered, the pages yellowed with age. The entries inside weren't her mother's handwriting, but belonged to a man named Daniel Hayes. Daniel Hayes wasn't a name Laura recognized, but the entries painted a picture of a man haunted by something in Ashwood. The first few pages were mundane, recounting daily life in the town during the 1960s. But as the entries progressed, they grew darker. The silence here isn't natural. It's watching, waiting. 3 more have vanished this month. No one talks about it. It's like the town forgets them the moment they're gone. I swear I heard it last night. It came from the woods. Laura couldn't shake the feeling that the diary was important. Though she had no idea why her mother would have kept it, she decided to stay in town for a few days to investigate, hoping to uncover more about Daniel Hayes and why he seemed so terrified. The next morning, Laura visited the town library, a small, musty building that hadn't seen an upgrade in decades. Behind the counter sat Mrs. Grayson, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a soft voice. When Laura asked about Daniel Hayes, Mrs. Grayson frowned. Her expression instantly guarded. Hayes, she said slowly. I haven't heard that name in years. He was a journalist, I think. Came here to write about the logging boom back in the 60s. Stayed for a while, then left. Do you know where I can find him? Laura asked. Mrs. Grayson shook her head. He didn't leave an address. Folks around here don't like to talk about him. He stirred up trouble before he disappeared. Laura frowned. Disappeared? Mrs. Grayson hesitated, then lowered her voice. He went out into the woods one night and never came back. Some say he got lost. Others, well, some say the woods took him. The mention of the woods sent a chill down Laura's spine. The forest that surrounded Ashwood had always felt wrong. As a child, she'd been warned never to wander too far into the trees. The adults never gave a reason, but the message was clear. The forest wasn't safe. As Laura left the library, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The streets were quiet, the few residents she passed avoiding eye contact. It was as though the entire town was holding its breath. That night, Laura stayed in her childhood home, a creaky, weather-beaten house on the outskirts of town. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the old wooden floors. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when she heard a low, faint hum, barely audible but undeniably real. Her heart raced as she sat up, straining to hear. The sound seemed to come from outside, growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't a natural sound, it was too mechanical, too deliberate. Grabbing a flashlight, Laura crept to the window. The yard was empty, the woods being still and dark, but the hum persisted, vibrating in her bones. Just your imagination, she whispered to herself, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. The next day, Laura decided to explore the woods, armed with Daniel's diary and a map she'd found in her mother's belongings. She set out along an overgrown trail that led deep into the forest. The trees were unnaturally dense, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The further she went, the more the air seemed to change, heavier, colder, and then she saw it, a small clearing, the ground covered in moss and strange markings carved into the trees. She pulled out the diary, flipping to an entry that described a similar location. The clearing isn't just a place, it's a doorway. I swear I saw something watching me from the other side. Laura's breath caught in her throat as the hum returned, louder and more insistent than before. She spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, but there was no one there. And then she saw them. Figures down scenes of them standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. Their faces were obscured, their bodies motionless, but they were undeniably human. "Hello," Laura called out, her voice trembling. The figures didn't respond. They simply stood there, watching. When she blinked, they were gone. Shaken, Laura stumbled back to town, her mind racing. She decided to visit the one person she thought might have answers, Father O'Connor, the priest who had been at the church since before she was born. The old man seemed surprised to see her but invited her in without question. As she recounted what she'd seen, his face grew pale. "You should leave, Laura," he said firmly. "The woods, they're not meant for us. They never were." "Why, what's out there?" Father O'Connor hesitated, then leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "The town has secrets. Child, secrets it's better you don't uncover. People have tried before, and it always ends the same way." Laura opened her mouth to argue, but the priest cut her off. "Leave Ashwood," he said, "before it's too late. Let's start our today's story, The Haunting Silence, a Town's Forgotten Secret." As Laura returned to her house that night, the hum followed her, growing louder and more insistent. She knew she should leave, but something about the woods, about Daniel Hayes and the diary, drew her in. She couldn't leave, not yet. Laura couldn't shake the ominous warning from Father O'Connor. His words echoed in her mind as she paced her living room, clutching the diary of Daniel Hayes. But no amount of caution could quell her curiosity. The strange hum, the figures in the clearing, the mysterious entries in the diary, none of it made sense, and Laura wasn't the type to leave questions unanswered. The next morning, she began piecing together Daniel's fragmented notes. His diary referenced places around Ashwood, specific trails, landmarks, and even cryptic names like the Singing Stone and the Hollow Ridge. Laura mapped out the locations as best she could, noticing a pattern. All the spots formed a loose circle, with a clearing at its center. Whatever Daniel was trying to uncover, it all pointed to the forest. Determined to dig deeper, Laura decided to visit Ashwood's Historical Society. It was a small building tucked away behind the town hall, its dim interior crammed with dusty books, faded photographs, and brittle newspaper clippings. Behind the front desk sat a wiry man in his 60s, with thick glasses and an eager smile. His name tag read Earl. "Looking for something specific?" he asked, peering at her curiously. "Actually, yes," Laura replied. "I'm trying to learn about Daniel Hayes and anything he might have been investigating before he disappeared." At the mention of Hayes, Earl's smile faltered. "Daniel Hayes," he repeated slowly, tapping his fingers on the desk. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in a long time. He was a reporter, wasn't he?" "That's what I've heard," Laura said. "Do you know what happened to him?" Earl hesitated, then leaned in. Hayes was digging into the town's past, asking questions most people didn't want to answer. He got real interested in the disappearances. "Disappearances?" Laura asked, her heart skipping a beat. Earl nodded. "Folks started going missing around the time the logging business dried up. It wasn't just one or two, it was down scenes. Mostly workers, but there were a few families, too. One day they were here, the next they were just gone. No bodies, no explanations." Laura felt a chill run down her spine. Did anyone ever figure out what happened? Earl shook his head. "No, and most people stopped asking. The town was already struggling, and talking about it just made things worse. Hayes was the only one who wouldn't let it go." "Do you have anything he wrote?" Earl gestured to a filing cabinet in the corner. "If he left anything, it'd be in there. Help yourself." Laura spent the next 2 hours sifting through faded articles, handwritten notes, and old photographs. Daniel's work painted a grim picture: mentions of strange lights in the woods, reports of odd sounds, and accounts from residents who claimed to see things they couldn't explain. One article caught her attention. It was an interview with an elderly man named Walter Bishop, who had worked in the forest for decades. "There's something wrong with those woods," Bishop had said. "The trees don't grow right. The animals avoid it. And at night, you hear things, voices, singing. It's like the forest is alive, and it doesn't want us there." Bishop had vanished shortly after the interview. Armed with new information, Laura prepared to venture deeper into the forest. She packed a bag with supplies: water, a flashlight, an old book, and a small pocket knife. Her unease grew as she stepped onto the overgrown trail leading back to the clearing. The hum started almost immediately, faint but persistent, like a distant engine. Laura pushed forward, her heart pounding with each step. The trees seemed denser this time, their twisted branches reaching toward her like skeletal fingers. When she reached the clearing, she saw that it had changed. The strange markings on the trees had multiplied, their shapes more intricate and unsettling. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl. And then she noticed something new, a large, flat stone in the center of the clearing, its surface etched with symbols similar to those on the trees. The Singing Stone, she thought, remembering the name from Daniel's diary. As she approached the stone, the hum grew louder, resonating deep in her chest. She hesitated, then reached out to touch the carvings. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, a sharp, electric jolt shot through her hand. Laura stumbled back, her vision swimming. When she looked up, she wasn't alone. The figures from before were back, standing at the edge of the clearing. This time, she could see them more clearly. They were pale and gaunt, their eyes sunken and empty. Their clothes were tattered, and their faces bore expressions of profound sorrow. "Who are you?" Laura whispered, her voice trembling. One of the figures, a woman, took a step forward. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Laura strained to hear, and then, faintly, she caught a single word. "Run." The hum suddenly shifted, growing into a deafening roar. The ground beneath Laura's feet began to shake, and the air filled with a high-pitched screech that made her ears ache. She turned and ran, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she fled the clearing. The roar followed her, accompanied by the sound of crashing branches and distant whispers. By the time Laura reached the edge of the forest, she was gasping for breath. She stumbled onto the road, collapsing to her knees as the hum faded into silence. She looked up to see David Hill, one of the few friends she'd kept in Ashwood, standing over her with a concerned expression. "Laura, what the hell were you doing in there?" he asked, helping her to her feet. I saw them," she said, struggling to catch her breath. "The people who disappeared. They're in the woods." David's face paled. "You need to stop this. Whatever you're looking for, it's not worth it." "But they're still alive," Laura insisted. "They need help." David shook his head. "You don't understand. The woods, they don't let people go. If you keep digging, you'll end up like them." "What do you mean?" David hesitated, then sighed. "There's a reason everyone stays quiet about this. The forest it's not natural, and whatever's in there doesn't want to be found." Laura's determination only grew. "Then why hasn't anyone tried to stop it?" "Because we can't," David said grimly. "We've tried, and every time, it only gets worse." That night, Laura Saturday in her childhood home, poring over the diary once more. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. The one question remained unanswered: what had caused the disappearances in the first place? As she read the final entries, her blood ran cold. "I think I found the source. It's not the forest itself, it's what's buried beneath it. Something ancient, something angry, and I'm going to expose it, no matter the cost." Laura realized with dawning horror that Daniel hadn't just been investigating disappearance, she'd been searching for something much bigger. And now, so was she. The hum returned that night, growing louder and more pervasive than ever. It seeped into every corner of Ashwood, vibrating in the walls of Laura's childhood home and reverberating in her chest. Sleep was impossible. Outside, the streets were deserted, but Laura could see lights flickering in the windows of her neighbors' houses. The town was awake, listening, afraid. David called her just after midnight. "It's worse than before," he said. "The hum, it's stronger." "I know," Laura replied, gripping her phone tightly. "It feels like it's coming from inside me." "Laura, I've been thinking, what if this isn't just about the forest? What if it's the town, too? Everything here feels connected." "It is," she said. "The sacrifices, the disappearances, it's all tied to whatever's under the forest. We have to go back, David. We have to stop it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, David spoke. "All right, but this time, we bring more than flashlights." Early the next morning, Laura and David raided the local hardware store, gathering anything they thought might help: rope, lanterns, climbing gear, and emergency supplies. David insisted on bringing a shotgun he'd inherited from his father, though neither of them believed it would do much against the entity in the woods. As they loaded the gear into David's truck, Laura noticed an elderly woman watching them from across the street. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes hollow. "Do you think she knows?" Laura asked quietly. David glanced at the woman. "They all know. They just pretend not to." The woman turned and shuffled away without a word. By midday, Laura and David were back at the forest's edge, standing in the shadow of the towering trees. The hum was omnipresent now, louder than it had ever been, making the air vibrate and their teeth ache. "This is it," Laura said, gripping her flashlight tightly. David nodded. Let's get this over with. They retraced their steps to the cavern's entrance, the moss-covered hill looming like a silent sentinel, the opening yawned before them, dark and uninviting. Inside, the air was colder than before, the metallic smell more pronounced. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, as if the cave itself were alive. This place feels wrong, David muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum. It's because it is, Laura replied. They pressed on, following the path to the massive chamber they'd discovered before. The altar was still there, its glowing symbols casting an eerie light across the walls. The shadows writhed at the edges of the room, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators sizing up their prey. Laura placed the notebook she'd taken from the altar into David's hands. Read this, she said. David flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with every word. Sacrifices, he muttered. They were feeding this thing to keep it contained, Laura said, but it's not enough anymore. David looked at the altar, then at the writhing shadows. If this seal breaks, it'll get out, Laura finished, and it won't stop with Ashwood. She approached the altar cautiously, her eyes scanning the symbols carved into its surface. They were ancient, intricate, and alien, glowing with a faint bluish light. What are you doing? David asked, his voice tinged with alarm. Trying to figure out how it works, Laura said. If the seal is breaking, there has to be a way to strengthen it. David hesitated. And what if there isn't? Laura didn't answer. As Laura examined the altar, a sudden chill filled the chamber. The shadows on the walls grew darker, their movements more erratic. The hum shifted, becoming deeper, more resonant. They know we're here, David said, gripping the shotgun tightly. From the far end of the chamber, figures began to emerge, pale, gaunt shapes with hollow eyes and tattered clothes. They were the people who had disappeared, or what was left of them. Laura, David's voice was barely a whisper. I see them, she said, backing away from the altar. The figures didn't move toward them. Instead, they formed a loose circle around the chamber, their empty eyes fixed on Laura and David. They're guarding it, Laura realized. They're part of the seal. What do you mean? David asked. They're sacrifices, she said, her voice trembling. Their souls are tied to this place, keeping it contained. One of the figures, a young woman with long, tangled hair, stepped forward. Her lips moved, forming words that Laura could barely hear over the hum. Help us! The revelation hit Laura like a punch to the gut. The sacrifices hadn't just been to appease the entity. They had been bound to the seal, their existence trapped in perpetual torment. We can't just leave them here, she said, her voice breaking. David looked at her like she was crazy. Laura, we don't even know what we're dealing with. If we try to mess with this, then it might break, she interrupted. I know, but if we don't do something, it's going to break anyway. David hesitated, then sighed. All right, what's the plan? Laura turned back to the altar. The seal is powered by the sacrifices. Right, if we can find a way to release them, maybe we can weaken the entity enough to contain it another way. Or we could unleash it completely, David said grimly. It's a risk we have to take, Laura said. As Laura began examining the altar more closely, the hum intensified. The shadows on the walls lashed out, tendrils of darkness striking the ground around them. They're trying to stop us, David said, raising the shotgun. Laura ignored the chaos, her fingers tracing the glowing symbols. One of them, a spiral at the center of the altar, seemed to pulse more brightly than the others. This is it, she said. This is the key. Before David could respond, a tendril of shadow struck him, sending him sprawling to the ground. David! Laura screamed. I'm fine, he groaned, scrambling to his feet. Just do whatever you're going to do, and do it fast. Laura placed her hand on the spiral. The moment she did, a surge of energy shot through her, filling her mind with a cacophony of voices, cries of anguish, whispers of despair, and one overwhelming command. Leave! She pushed through the pain, focusing all her energy on the spiral. The symbols on the altar began to glow brighter, and the chamber was filled with a blinding light. The figures around the chamber began to dissolve, their forms breaking apart into particles of light. The shadows writhed in agony, their movements becoming frantic and disjointed. It's working, Laura shouted. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, and then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Laura collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. David staggered toward her, his face pale and bloodied. Did we do it? He asked. Laura looked at the altar. The symbols were gone, their light extinguished. The shadows had vanished, and the figures were no longer there. I think so, she said. The sacrifices are free. As they made their way out of the cave, the forest seemed lighter. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost peaceful. But Laura couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. "We stopped it for now," she said as they reached the edge of the woods. "But whatever that thing is, it's still down there, and it's not going to stay contained forever." David nodded grimly. "Then we'd better figure out how to stop it for good." The forest was silent, too silent. For the first time in days, Laura and David found themselves free from the oppressive hum that had plagued Ashwood. Yet the stillness felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. As they stood at the edge of the woods, looking back toward the cavern they'd just fled, they knew their work wasn't done. "We freed the sacrifices," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But whatever's in that cavern, it's still there, and it's still dangerous." David nodded, wiping blood from his face. "We've bought ourselves time, but not much. If that thing gets out, it won't stop with Ashwood." Laura tightened her grip on the journal in her hand. Daniel Hayes' final words, the only guide they had. Somewhere in those pages was the answer. She was sure of it, but finding it would mean confronting the truth about Ashwood's dark history and making a sacrifice of their own. Returning to Ashwood, Laura and David were met with chaos. The hum may have stopped, but its absence had only fueled the town's paranoia. People roamed the streets, their faces pale and haunted, whispering about shadows and lost loved ones. Father O'Connor stood at the church steps, calling for calm, but his words fell on deaf ears. The townsfolk knew something terrible was coming, even if they couldn't articulate it. Laura approached the priest, her jaw set. "You knew about the seal," she said, holding up the journal. "You knew about the sacrifices." Father O'Connor's face crumpled with guilt. "I didn't have a choice. None of us did. It was the only way to protect the town." "You didn't protect anyone," David snapped. "You condemned them." "The sacrifices were supposed to hold it back," the priest said, his voice shaking, "but the forest's hunger grew stronger. We were desperate." "It's not just the forest," Laura said. "It's what's beneath it, and if we don't stop it now, it'll consume everything." Father O'Connor hesitated, then nodded. "What do you need from me?" That evening, Laura and David gathered a small group of people they trusted. Father O'Connor, Dr. Emil Harper, the town's elderly historian, and Anna Morales, a fiercely independent park ranger who knew the forest better than anyone. Laura laid the journal on the table in the church basement. According to Daniel Hayes, the seal was created centuries ago, using a combination of ancient symbols and the sacrifices of the townspeople. "But the seal is failing. We need to create a new one." "How?" Anna asked. "We need to weaken the entity," Laura said. "It feeds on fear and silence. We have to confront it, disrupt its power. If we can weaken it enough, we can trap it again." Dr. Harper frowned. "And what happens to us if we fail?" David's voice was grim. "If we fail, there won't be any left to worry about." The group set out at dawn, armed with whatever tools and knowledge they could muster. Anna led the way, navigating the dense forest with ease. As they neared the cavern, the hum returned, faint at first but growing louder with every step. The shadows were waiting for them. Tendrils of darkness snaked between the trees. Watching, waiting, the group pressed on, their fear palpable. When they reached the cavern, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The altar was still there, its symbols faint and flickering. The walls of the chamber pulsed with an unnatural light, and the shadows moved with a terrifying purpose. "It's growing stronger," Laura said, her voice trembling. "Then we don't have much time," David replied. As the group spread out, Laura approached the altar, clutching the journal tightly. The symbols on its surface had faded, but she could still make out the spiraled heart of the seal. "Here," she said, pointing to the spiral. "This is where we need to focus." Father O'Connor began chanting a prayer, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Dr. Harper and Anna set up lanterns and ropes, preparing for whatever came next. But the entity wasn't going to let them succeed. The shadows surged forward, forming into shaped humanoid figures with hollow eyes and jagged limbs. They attacked with ferocity, driving the group back toward the walls of the chamber. "Keep them off me," Laura shouted as she began tracing the spiral with her finger, trying to reactivate the seal. David fired the shotgun, the blast echoing through the chamber. The shadows recoiled but didn't retreat. Anna swung a lantern at them, the light momentarily dispersing their forms. "They don't like the light," she yelled. Laura closed her eyes, focusing all her energy on the spiral. She could feel the entity's presence in her mind, a cold, malevolent force pressing against her thoughts. It whispered to her, promising power, begging for release. "You won't win," she whispered. The spiral began to glow faintly, its light growing stronger with each passing second. The hum intensified, shaking the chamber violently. "Laura, hurry!" David shouted, reloading the shotgun. "I'm trying," she yelled back. Father O'Connor joined her at the altar, placing his hands over hers. Together, they chanted a prayer, their voices rising above the roar of the hum. The light from the spiral surged, filling the chamber with a blinding brilliance. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness. As the light consumed the chamber, the altar began to crack. Laura realized with a sinking heart that the seal wasn't just a symbol, it was a prism. And to repair it, someone had to stay behind. She looked at David, tears streaming down her face. "It needs someone to complete it." "No," he said, shaking his head. "We'll find another way." "There isn't time," she said. "If we don't do this now, it'll get out." Father O'Connor stepped forward. "I'll do it," he said. "No," Laura said firmly. "This is my fight." Before anyone could stop her, she placed her hands on the altar and whispered the final words from the journal. The light engulfed her, and the hum stopped. When the light faded, the cavern was empty. The altar had been restored, its symbols glowing faintly once more. The shadows were gone, and the oppressive presence had vanished. David fell to his knees, staring at the place where Laura had stood. "She did it," he said, his voice breaking. The group emerged from the forest, the morning sun shining down on Ashwood. The town was quiet, but it felt different, now lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Laura was gone, but her sacrifice had saved them all. Months later, David stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the trees. The hum was gone, but it could still feel her presence, a faint echo in the silence. Ashwood was rebuilding, its people finally free from the curse that had haunted them for generations. But David knew the forest's secrets could never truly be buried. Somewhere beneath the trees, the entity still lingered, trapped but waiting. And Laura was watching, guarding the seal, ensuring that the silence remained unbroken. If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share and subscribe the channel. Help us grow. Thanks for watching.